Helen?
Um, I'm a fourth generation American. My grandparents were born here. As a matter of fact, my grandfather was born in Deadwood, South Dakota. And if you can imagine that with the Chinese people coming to work on the railroads, that's that era. He didn't work on the railroads, but that was a part of the scene. He and his family in Deadwood had a grocery store. But that's where I came from. But I was born in Hong Kong. My father worked for the State Department, and that's where we were when I was born. Actually, as a matter of fact, my siblings were born in Hong Kong too at different times.
So he worked for the State Department in an age where not a lot of Asian Americans were in the State Department, is that right?
There were very few Asian Americans there, and it was a very tough job. It was very hard to get ahead. So you had to work very hard, despite the fact that you're the only person who can do what you do in your department. Well, I lived in all different places because he worked for the State Department. His postings would be 2 years here, 2 years there, and so I didn't spend all my time in Hong Kong. I was born in Hong Kong. I spent time in Thailand. I spent time in Germany. I spent time in France. We went back to Hong Kong, and then I graduated high school, and I came back. That's when I started my real American education. Although I did spend a couple of months here and there in between home leave going to American schools. Well, from my background, because we moved around so much, we hardly had time to cultivate that community feeling, to cultivate old friends. It's very different from growing up in Studio City and having a core group of friends and people and joining a group at school. So it was very different in that way.
Did you have siblings?
I have one of each, younger, yeah.
You make it sound like my growing up years are in the past. I'm still growing up, and I'm still a kid. My parents were both born in China. They grew up in China. They came in the middle of a war, World War II. They were young adults when they came to the United States. Can I brag about them a little bit? So I'll brag about my mom in particular, because neither she nor my dad would talk about China or the war. My dad never said a word. My mom less than 5 times mentioned something over all the years growing up. But I do remember that she mentioned Japanese bombers and being bombed. And on at least one occasion, she was in an area where there were Japanese troops that at the time, as I think a lot of people in the Army do, they do bad things to civilian populations. But she went to college. That's where she met my dad. And then there's a lot I hadn't heard about until I was an adult. In fact, not until the last 6, 7 years. I didn't think much of the fact that she was a woman who went to college in the late 30s, early 40s. Now, that alone is startling, because I only knew her as someone who cooked wonderful Chinese food, but also very, very good spaghetti and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that she made. She meets my father. He's a couple years ahead of her. He then leaves China to go to graduate school at MIT. She has a few more years to finish. And the war is raging on, and Japan is occupying more and more of China. And she decides that she's going to go to the United States, try and meet up with the person who would become my father. So travel is very difficult because of the war, and she decides the way to get to the United States is to go to India. Now, I didn't know this until recently, but you can imagine a young girl, young woman, traveling a great distance would be startling enough if there was no war, but she's traveling in the middle of a war. So her plan is to go to India, get on a ship to go to the United States, because she can't go to the coast in China because it's all occupied by the Japanese troops. So she gets to India, tries to get on a boat, can't get on a boat. Next day, same thing, next day, same thing, second week, same thing. So she spends about 3 months and finally gets on a freighter. Now, if you think about that, this young Chinese woman getting on a freighter in the 1940s, early 1940s. And freighters had to avoid Japanese submarines, so they go far south to avoid the submarines. And eventually, this particular ship gets to the west coast of the United States. She gets on a train. She goes to the Boston area and meets up with my father. She also enrolls at MIT. They get married, and then in a little more than a year, start a family. Now, I remember my mom just working as a department store clerk, part-time, to earn a little extra money. I didn't know any of the story that I just shared with you. So she's kind of a hero for me. So my father studied chemical engineering, and he got his doctorate. And my mother was studying economics, but because they started to raise a family, she dropped out of school.
But war does a lot of things to families. The family members take diversions that they normally would not take. So the story could have been so different if it weren't for the war.
Yes.
My family too, yeah.
My mom was one of 5 children, and she was the only who came to the United States, so I never knew that set of aunts and uncles. And my father was one of 11, and 2 of his sisters ended up in the United States, but the other 8 I've never known, never met.
Because my mother was born in Shanghai. My father, although he was an American citizen, he was born in New Territories in Hong Kong. And my grandfather, my paternal grandfather at the time, had a business there. And then the war came. My mother's family moved down from Shanghai to Hong Kong to escape the Japanese. And that's how that whole thing evolved, and that's why we were there. That's why we were born there, not just myself, but my cousins too. Otherwise, it would have been different.
And then to come from that situation to have your father end up with a position in the State Department, that's probably another story
Right.
itself.
That is. He always had some kind of an association with the American embassy. There was no embassy those days. It was like consulate and stuff. And I think he did a lot of translation and a lot of liaison with them as a young man. And because his younger brothers had both immigrated here before they got married to go to school. My uncle went to Caltech, my other uncle went to Davis. So because his family now is in California, in Los Angeles, we also congregated here. When I was younger, before Eugene invented Asian Americans, there was no such concept. I knew I was an American citizen, but I also knew personally I was Chinese. And I think our parents always made you realize you're Chinese. And we will speak Chinese at home. And therefore I did. So it's a little different from children nowadays. Well, my family is here. My cousins, my uncles, everybody I was related to was here actually in Los Angeles. I have some relatives in San Francisco also, but mostly my paternal family is here. So it was a no-brainer. You come here where your folks are, and this is what you do.
And what did you want to get out of going to school here? Do you remember
Well,
what your major was?
Initially, when I came here, I went and lived with my uncle. This is those days when you don't travel by yourself. You got to remember, I graduated in '65.
That was the last century.
I went to El Camino College for 2 years, and then I transferred over here. And it was, those days, it was very easy. You make the grades, you just come to school. It was not as highly competitive as it is now, and it should be that way. But
Did you know you wanted to be a teacher back then?
pretty much. And I was really interested in early childhood development and early childhood education. I was a psych major, so I really enjoyed that type of thing. I didn't know whether I was going to do educational testing or whatever. I just wanted to know I just knew that I wanted to be involved in that type of education. Actually, I gave serious thought to doing just educational testing, because it wasn't very sophisticated then, and it needed fixing.
First, I had the aspiration to get in because I applied and they turned me down. And they turned me down because I didn't meet the requirements. I needed to have a high school diploma, and I didn't have a high school diploma because I had dropped out of high school. I had traveled some, came back to Los Angeles, and then decided, well, maybe I'll go to college. That might be fun. So they turned me down, and I went to the administration building long before it was called Murphy Hall, and talked to someone at the admissions office, and they turned me down again, and then I visited again and got turned down again, and again the same happened. So finally, in one of my visits, this very nice lady said, well, come back in a couple days, and I'm not promising anything. So when I went back, a couple days later, she said, we'll admit you. So I was very lucky. The price was really nice. If you added up all the fees, athletic card, student union fee, I think there was a health fee, it cost $80.50 per quarter. So that was affordable, but I needed to earn some money, so I usually worked 40, 60 hours, menial jobs, because I needed to earn money for room and board and other things like that. And I was interested in learning about everything and anything under the sun. Didn't matter to me what it was. It could be the sciences, math, English literature, art history, anything else. So I thought, what a glorious place this is. It doesn't cost very much, lots of interesting people, film festivals, interesting speakers. Many parts of campus are gorgeous today and were gorgeous then. So I just loved it, and there were all kinds of other activities always going on, political things as well as many, many other things. So I started out as a math major, and one had to run for classes at the time, which meant...
Do you know what running for classes is?
Okay, so if you want to sign up for a math class, you go to the math department on registration day, and then you get in line and you sign up for the math class or classes that you want. Now, if you want an art history class, you have to run to the other side, to the north side of campus, get in another line, and then sign up for an art history class. And then if you wanted a chemistry class, you'd have to go back, and you would run to the southern part of campus. And that's why it was called running for classes, because literally people ran for classes.
And
now,
they only had so many openings, and they handed out these cards.
right, punch cards.
Punch cards. And once they run out of it, that class is closed. That's it. So you planned out where you went, because you want to get your basics down. You've got to have 101, English, whatever. You get up early and you line up there first and you run around and get what you need to graduate. I mean, running.
So someone told me that you didn't have to run for classes in another college, because there were 3 colleges: College of Letters and Science, which was by far the largest. There was a College of Fine Arts, and then there was the College of Engineering. So someone who was in the College of Engineering told me that they didn't run for classes. I said, well, how's that so? He said, you just fill out a bunch of forms and punch cards, you submit it to the College of Engineering, so you didn't have any of this nonsense. I said, oh, that seems like a good idea. So I transferred to the College of Engineering. And then 2 quarters later, the associate dean calls me into his office and says, why are you in the College of Engineering? So I explained to him what I just explained now. And he said, that's not a good reason. I said, I think it was a terrific reason. He said, but if you're in the College of Engineering, you should take engineering classes. I said, I figured that was the case, but you see, I took 1 or 2 engineering classes the last couple quarters. And he said, yes, but we have a prescribed curriculum. You're supposed to take all engineering classes, but have 1 elective outside the College of Engineering. I said, oh. He said, we'd love to have you. You're welcome to stay, but you have to take the prescribed curriculum. And so I said, no, thank you. So I transferred back to Letters and Science. Then at a certain point, I think after one had enough units beyond what would be the sophomore year, I'd get a letter in the mail, and it would say I had to declare a major. So I put it in my circular file. And then a year, year and a half goes by, whatever the time period was, and the dean of students for the entire university, so 1 dean of students for the entire undergraduate university, calls me into his office. I don't know why these deans are so interested in me. And he says, you have more than enough units to graduate, but you're undeclared. I said, yeah, I know. He said, well, the regents want us to graduate people, and we looked up majors that you're close in, and it happened just by chance. He had 4 or 5 majors. He said, you're close in chemistry, you're close in economics, you're close in this and close in this. And he said, why don't you pick one of these majors and graduate? Because you have to do that. And then he said, didn't we send you a letter? I said, yes. What did you do with it? I said, my circular file. And we didn't do anything in response. We didn't send a follow-up letter. I said, I got a follow-up letter from you every quarter. Thank you very much. And I did the same thing with the letters. I put it in the same file. So he laughed a little bit. I think he was humoring me. He said, well, why don't you pick a major? So because political science, I think, was the easiest major, and just by chance, I needed 1 course. So I took a political science class, and then they kicked me out. I had no clue as to what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do with any major or what I wanted to do long term in life.
So before I go on to your graduate studies career or story, when you both first came to UCLA, that was in '65.
I think you were referring to your
I'm sorry,
graduation
67.
from high school.
Yeah, from high school, sorry.
Yeah.
67, you came to UCLA, is that right?
No, I graduated in '65 from
Yes.
high school. Then I graduated from UCLA in '69
Okay. And you went to El Camino for 2 years?
for 2 years.
Okay,
You had it right, I think.
okay, 68, 69, okay. And then you came in
I think it was 1967.
67 and graduated in
Uh,
71?
yes, I think the official graduation is 71. It was a little bit of an odd thing because I'd actually finished earlier. Oh, and then I was going to join another institution. Well, I had 3 choices. One choice was to visit our friendly neighbor to the north, Canada, and stay there for a very long period of time. Another was to go to jail, or another was to join the Army, because I was 1A and didn't have a deferment and a very low draft number. So I was soon to get drafted. But as luck had it, I still had time left on my undergraduate eligibility. I hadn't used 4 years. I probably had used 3 years or 2 3/4 years. And that's because I'd signed up every quarter for a lot of classes. Out of curiosity, an undergraduate now, when I was at UCLA, it had a quarter system, and people would usually have 12 or 16 units. Is it very similar today? Okay. So I would sign up for 28 units as an example. So that's why I had so many units and why they wanted to kick me out. But there was a new graduate program formed, and it was going to receive a lot of funds from the federal government. And a fellow by the name of C.Z. Wilson, who I met a year or two earlier, said they're forming this program and he'd like me to be in that program. And I told him about my draft problem, and he said, well, but you still have time left for your undergraduate eligibility. Anyway, so I thought, well, if there's a fourth choice, I can still be a student here at UCLA and enjoying everything that one enjoys about a university campus. Why don't I do that? So that's what I ended up doing until I finished the graduate program. It was called Urban Educational
Policy.
Urban Educational Policy and Planning, and it was an interdisciplinary program. And what I did was, well, in addition to taking courses and things like that, I was looking at better ways to govern urban schools, basically. So that was a lot of fun. And as with all my other time at UCLA, I was just learning something new every week. I got a master's degree, and then I got a PhD in the same area. And then I thought, I learned a little bit about law because I was reading about a case in California. It was called Serrano versus Priest, and it had to do with the funding of public schools. In the funding of public schools, the obligation is with the state, but a lot of the funds come from local school districts. So wealthy school districts could spend 30, 50, 100% more per student versus less well-off school districts. And there were lawyers and groups challenging that on a variety of different grounds. The Serrano case I mentioned said that the state couldn't have that system which discriminated against students who happened to be in poor districts. Eventually, a very similar case went to the Supreme Court. The name of the case is Rodriguez. But anyway, so my interest in education and some side reading, which I just described, led me to think, well, maybe I'll learn a little bit about law. So I was finishing the PhD, and then I decided maybe I'll go plant myself someplace and learn some law. So I wrote to Yale and said, I've kind of made this up, but I'm going to finish my PhD. What if I come and hang out with you, and I'll learn some things and do some research and writing? And they said, okay. Helen thought we were going to live in this nice little New England home with a white picket fence.
We're going to live in Connecticut.
Yes, and the idea of a fireplace and a white picket fence sounded pretty good, so we packed up, moved across the country, and of course Yale is surrounded by slums.
So you
And
live in New Haven.
yeah, so we lived in, we had very nice landlords, but the whole basic area is pretty slummy. And it was fun for a year, and then after that I was thinking, well, maybe I'll go and teach or do something else, or maybe go to law school. In the end, I decided just to go to law school, but I wasn't planning to be a lawyer, and we didn't care for New Haven very much, so that's why we moved to the Boston area, and I ended up going to law school at Harvard.
He's being too modest because Yale offered him to let him join the JD program, but he didn't want to do that because he didn't want this to be a precedent for other people who wanted to get into law school but couldn't, to try to get in the back door. So it's easier for him to take an alternative.
But they did say, by the way,
He won't tell you that. But
just before I was finishing that year, they said, you know what you did is a pretty good idea. We're thinking of starting a program for people who don't necessarily want to be lawyers, and what if we give you a degree? Because I was just hanging out for a year. I was not in any kind of degree program. So they created a degree program. I think I was the first one to receive a degree, so I have a master's degree from Yale. But I think it was just tricky. They get to solicit me every year to contribute to the school. But many other people since then have enrolled in the program. An example would be someone who is a journalist and covers the Supreme Court for the New York Times, but doesn't have any formal legal training, would go off to Yale, spend a year, get some formal legal training, and that's just an example of how people who don't want to be lawyers, but learning law might help what they're really doing.
So the big irony is you did become a lawyer.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
That really is crazy.
But before we get to that, because I think others that I've talked to, they're not surprised that you became, a top lawyer in the country. I think Vivian mentioned that you were a genius here at age 16 when you started college, so that means you probably skipped a few grades.
Well,
but
I
it
was
seems like-
precocious.
But it seemed like just your thirst for learning was something that was...
well,
quite
he comes from a very smart family. They're all geniuses. But when he was in high school, he was so bored. He told the teachers, look, give me the test. I'll just test out. I don't need English 101. I don't need basic social studies 102. Just give me the test. I'll test out. And they wouldn't let him do that. And that's why he left school. That's why he doesn't have a high school diploma.
But I had fun along the way. So one example is they had what they called honors classes, and so I was put in honors classes. And
At UCLA?
no. This is back in high school. So my family had moved to Orange County, and I'd grown up in the New York area before that, and it's Villa Park High School in the Orange Unified School District in Orange County. So there was a final exam, and it was a true-false exam. And at the end of the exam, the teacher would pick up all the students' papers and then have other students grade the papers of their fellow students. So pretty easy to grade because it's true, false, and the teacher just went through all the answers. So I could hear from a corner of the room some voices saying, Morgan got a 0 on the exam? He what? He got a 0? He got a 0? And the teacher could hear it too. So he's picking up the exams. So he picks up my exam, and I got a 0. So I was having fun along the way, but he looked really angry, and he starts walking to me, striding, and fumes coming out of his ears, and I thought, I don't think this is going to be a very successful conversation. So right as he got up to my desk, I got up and just walked out of the room. I thought he should have had a better sense of humor. But it could have been disastrous, right? What if I got 4 of the questions
just one.
correct?
Right.
Yeah, just,
It's hard to get 0.
Right.
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 So-
It's exactly the
so you
same as
know.
getting everything right. So like the joke is on the teacher, but he didn't get it.
That's why you say you're still a little boy. So you still,
Well, he still does the same
things like
thing
that.
nowadays.
That's good. That keeps you young. So.
Those days, people were very conscious that they had to volunteer. Volunteerism is a big deal. And you serve your community and you define whatever that is, whether it's cultural, language, whatever. So I became interested in the what the Asian American Studies Center was doing, which was trying to provide education for people who lived in Chinatown. In those days, Chinatown was relatively small, and most of the immigrants were from Hong Kong. They were Cantonese speaking. It's different now. And they all concentrated right there. What was the name of the street? Alpine and those streets. It was all concentrated there. And so it was kind of easy to target your audience. They were not spread out in Monterey Park. You don't have to go find them in Alhambra. They were all right there. And so first I became interested in working with the children that were at Castellar Elementary School. So you go down on Saturday and you have your 2T and you help them learn English because their parents did not speak English at home. And then what I found more helpful is teaching the adults English because the children pick it up fast enough. And once a week is not going to help them that much. Plus, they were all such good students. They didn't need any help with their homework. They all knew how to do it properly, lickety-split. So I became interested in teaching the adults. And they were a really great community to serve because they were earnest. They came to class. They always did their homework. I have to say, not all of them were literate in Chinese either. So it was a little difficult.
So, was that through the Asian American Tutorial Project?
No, this was independent of that. I don't know how we hooked up with Lincoln High School Adult Education. That's what it was. So they sponsored English as a second language classes for adults. So we became the branch of night school, but we were centered in at Castellar, not at Lincoln, where I forgot where Lincoln High School is, East LA.
but this was an outgrowth of what people in the local community had organized.
Right.
So what happened was people in the Chinatown area, because of the change in the immigration laws, realized that there were going to be a lot of people coming from Asia. Before this change, I think it was enacted in 1965, but the full implementation didn't take place immediately. It took a couple years. People who were not from Western European countries had very few slots to come to the United States. So if you were from Eastern Europe, your chances of ever coming to the United States was extremely low. So same is true from all countries in Asia. So naturally, with a change in the law that didn't quite equalize everything, but opened the doors more equitably, there were going to be a lot of people, and not surprisingly, a lot of people from China or surrounding countries, which over the centuries have had Chinese emigrate to those other countries, would be coming to the United States. So the people organizing it sent flyers to local colleges. So I happened to see a flyer and said, oh, this seems interesting. And I got someone to give me a ride down to this meeting in Chinatown. And people were talking about how to provide services for the influx of new immigrants. And the most obvious one was help people learn how to speak English, because nobody was doing anything. Not the federal government, the state government, the local school district, the county, or anyone else.
Well, in addition to the lack of English, they also didn't know how to qualify for food stamps, Social Security, whatever was available to them, because you just simply didn't know or didn't dare. So being able to be there, being able to speak the language really helped them out.
So my problem was that at the end of the meeting, I needed to get back to the west side where I was living, and I needed to find someone to ask for a ride. So I looked around and I thought, well, there's a really pretty girl over there, and maybe she's a student, and I'll just approach her and ask if she's a student, and if she is, where she's going. Would have been my luck. If she was going to USC, then I wouldn't take a ride with her. But as it turns out, it was Helen. She had a car, and she was going to the west side. So that's how we met.
It was pretty sneaky.
Yeah,
It is.
yeah. And I'm not going to tell the truth as to how I planned this and plotted this just to meet you.
No, kept on hanging around my apartment. Go home!
That was after.
I have to go to school. I
That
have
was
to go
after
to
we met.
class.
Anyway, so the adult classes, I think, were an outgrowth of that initial meeting. And then Helen was finishing her studies at UCLA and was going to begin teaching. So during the day, she taught full-time at Kessler in Chinatown and would stay down. And then in the evening, 4 nights a week, would teach ESL to adults.
You can do that when you're young. You can't do it now.
The evening was volunteer work.
No, it was minimum wage. I think I made $12. But I had to stay there. My students went home at 3 o'clock. My night school began at 7:30. So I had to pull my heels down there because I couldn't go back home and then come back.
You don't mean $12 an hour though, that.
No, I meant $12 for the shop for the class, which was an hour.
No, just because minimum wage back then, right? You were paid very little.
Yeah,
I thought it was more than an hour long.
Yeah, I don't remember. It was.
I thought
It wasn't worth the
2.5
gas
hours
money.
or
Yeah.
something.
It wasn't worth the gas money.
But you said that there was a spirit of volunteerism during that time that was pretty pervasive, would you
Mhm.
say?
Hmm.
Yeah, I think so.
Can you, how did that connect with the way that you were raised too as a child? I mean, was that similar, were those similar values? I mean, not everybody volunteered, so I'm just trying to get a little bit more at what motivated you to do all of that?
Well, I can't say that I learned how to do that from childhood because I've never stuck around long enough anywhere to kind of generate that kind of feeling. But then when you work in Chinatown, you realize there was a need. You just had to do that.
I thought that there was a sense of volunteerism among many people, not all people by any means. There were many things happening at the same time. There was this raging war in Vietnam, and there were a lot of different facets to it. Big superpower, the United States, tiny little country, Vietnam. There was the corruption of the leadership of the South Vietnamese government. There were nasty ways to describe the Vietnamese people, and soldiers or others didn't separate out different Asians from those who were enemy combatants. And it's quite common in wars, understandably, why people demonize the enemy soldiers. But people in the United States then, as in past wars, World War II as an example, sometimes said, oh, the enemy is Japan, so everyone, including US citizens that are Japanese Americans, must be bad, so we should throw them behind barbed wire. There are lots of reasons why many people thought the war was wrong, immoral, unjust, but there was an added reason, for me at least, being Asian American. I'm thinking, really? I'm going to go there, carry a rifle, and shoot other Asians? And what's the reason for that? And it didn't seem to have much of a reason. There was also at this time a lot of other turmoil. 1968 had two major assassinations. One was Martin Luther King, I think it was April, and then Bobby Kennedy in June. Both terrific leaders, even if someone disagreed with their particular views on an issue. The whole idea that in the United States we would have people take a gun and be able to assassinate some of our leaders was shocking. There were riots in the streets in many major cities in the United States. The riots weren't just because of the assassination of Martin Luther King. There was a big class divide that also correlated highly with race. So people in poor black neighborhoods in Los Angeles and Detroit and many, many other cities had a match that was being lit where all the tinder wood was there and those riots came into being. So it focused at least some part of the country, and certainly I think a lot of students, on the economic distance that separated people in the United States. And it wasn't just the question of someone worked harder than someone else and therefore had a little better living. The fact that it did seem to correlate with race. There were differences in educational achievements. And even in single groups, I'll take Asian Americans as an example. People used to speak about, I think they still do, the model minority. But they were looking at a slice usually of Japanese and Chinese Americans, and they forgot that there were other slices of Japanese and Chinese Americans and Filipinos and Koreans and many other Asian American Pacific Islanders. The university then was viewed as an elitist institution, even though it was a public university. One of the programs that I volunteered for was, we called it High Pot. It was very fitting because it was also
They were
in
high
the
on pot,
in
the third floor.
the 60s. I wouldn't admit to anything, and I won't confess for others, but it was the high potential program, so we thought it was nice to call it High Pot. So I thought it was really cool and hip to say, I'm a tutor for High Pot. So people wondered if I could
Their office was right here.
do experimental things instead of teaching people how to do math or English or whatever. But all these things were going on that led to a lot of the politics on campus. There was a time that UCLA twice, once in 1970, once in 1972. The latter one was during the bombing of Cambodia, where significant numbers of police came onto campus. There were some students who were killed. There were many students who were badly injured by the police. The students, well, yeah, we broke some windows and sat in on the administration building all night. Bill Walton was there. He was as far as away from me as you are now, there all night, even though he was either the best or one of the best basketball players in college at the time, but he was always very politically active. So there was...
Were you there? Were either of you there when the police came on campus?
Yes, yes.
Can you describe what happened from your vantage point? Because we saw a memo lodged against the administration for
Yeah.
the ways that the police handle themselves, but if you have any first-hand recollections.
I remember coming up to Campbell Hall, and people were scrambling, and they were, I don't remember if it was the second floor or the third floor, but they were on the second floor, and they were ducking behind those old-fashioned desks that they used to have to be safe. And then I thought the African American Studies Center was up here on the third floor.
Yes.
And there was all kinds of things going on, and they're afraid the police was going to come up here and was going to shoot somebody in the stairway. It was like that.
Well, police did come into buildings. I think they did come into Campbell Hall at one point in time. They went into the University Research Library. Several people described to me, I wasn't in the University Research Library at the time, where they grabbed a student who had been out, and then as the police, they would march in lines. They would have tear gas and their helmets and everything. And so the students would often scatter. A student, probably with others, ran into the URL, and the police ran in, and the student said, "You're breaking my arm, you're breaking my arm," crack. And the police broke his arm. But they also, the police, and I'll include the university police, and this next tale, by using the word tale, I don't mean it's fictional, but the next story, students were marching on ROTC, because they're the military, and they were in the old men's gym. Huge crowd built up, and I was near the front of the crowd. The amazing thing when there's a huge crowd of people, you have no ability to move in any direction that you want to move. Everyone's pressed up against each other. The crowd is pressing up against the men's gym. People threw rocks, broke the windows. And then there were the big doors. There was a series of steps, big doors, and students were pounding on the doors. And I was maybe second or third row students behind the people who were right at the door. And I guess the doors did come down or were forced open. So some students leaned in, and what I remember was seeing these billy clubs in a blur, and they went whack, 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 whack. And the students who were in the first or second row, they were having their heads split open, the blood was flying, and people reeling backwards, and the crowd trying to move back, but having a difficult time. Now, at the same time, then and now when I think about it, it must have been pretty scary if you're one of 24 police officers there and you look out and there are several thousand students. Maybe you're going to assume the students are all unarmed, but so what? It's got to be scary from that point of view. There was a time that when the campus was shut down for a sustained period, it wasn't just one day, but the entire campus shut down and went day after day after day. And there was an informal coordinating group of students that decided to meet in the student union, Ackerman Union. And the meetings would have 50 or 60 people, and they're really pretty chaotic. And at one point after the first day, some people said, "Well, Morgan, why don't you chair this meeting?" I said, "No, I don't want to chair it." But they kept insisting that I ought to chair it. So I ended up chairing the meeting. I remember sitting down there, a lot of people who would be very helpful. Some I'd known before, some I didn't know before. But they would point out to me, some of them, who the police were. Well, some were easy to spot. They had the buzz cuts and they looked a little older and things like that. But there were others who weren't quite so obvious. But it's no surprise to me that there would be undercover police or other law enforcement people there. There were also crazies, and they may have been students or they could have been just crazies who weren't students. I'll give you an example. This will sound like it is pure fiction. Someone says, "Let's take over Catalina Island," right? And I'm roughly following Robert's Rules of Order. So if someone raises their hand, I call on them, and there's free speech. I'm going, "What?" He says, "Yeah, we've got guns, and we can get more guns." I'm thinking, am I hearing this correctly? And we can just go and take over Catalina Island and we'll declare it's a new country. By the way, I think it was not too long after that, Native Americans took over, was it Alcatraz, and occupied it for an extended period of time. Now, Alcatraz doesn't really have much in the way of water supplies, which I might have picked Angel Island if I was in the Bay Area. Anyway, so there were crazes like that. Another occasion, someone pulled out, he was heated, arguing a point, pulled out a huge knife, and then a couple of people yelled, "He's got a knife!" But about 3 or 4 people jumped him, took the knife away from him. But we had this coordinating committee. Anyone could show up, but usually if there was a student group of any kind that wanted to participate, many of them ethnic-related groups, many of them not ethnic-related groups, some just politically oriented groups, they could show up, and it was a way to coordinate student activities, to protest the war, and decide what we were going to do next.
Was this part of this was a coalition, not a specific organization?
Correct. It just grew up. People said, we need a way to coordinate. Let's try and have meetings in a particular location in the student union.
And what period of time, do you remember what years? That was?
Yeah, it was during the protests, I believe in 1972.
Yeah, I had been wondering if there were many other Asian Americans involved with you in part of that kind of organizing circle of the anti-war protests at that time, and you started talking about the demographics of the campus.
I'm sure that there were people of color who were involved, but the numbers were so small, and I don't recall there being a large number in terms of absolute numbers, or that they were well organized, that anyone was well organized. There may have been some groups well organized, but the absolute numbers were modest. Well, I do recall that there, whether it was people individually or collectively who ended up working in connection with the Asian American Studies Center, did care passionately about the war. But the central focus tended to be what was originally called Oriental Studies, and then later Asian American Studies, as opposed to protesting the war. And whatever it was, 90% of the people protesting the war could care less about ethnic studies. But that's not to suggest that there was this complete separation. At least for me, it was people seeing injustices at the time and willing to stand up and protest against them and to say we ought to do things differently, we ought to make the world a better place.
So that was kind of a theme that brought the two of you together.
Yes.
I guess. Never thought of it that way.
Yeah, our getting together definitely made the world a better place. At least for me.
Did you want to talk about that at all, that part of your life at all?
Sure, what would you like to know?
Well, obviously, you spotted Helen from afar and made a first move.
Yes.
And I'm sure there was more work to do after that.
All for Helen. So we got together and then started living together, and then eventually tried to get married.
And when I started teaching, I worked very hard at what I did, because there was not an understanding about teaching young children, especially teaching young children from a different ethnic background. So it was a real uphill fight. The principal at the school, let's put it that way, had been there for ages and was a very conservative white woman. you know, oh, aren't those Oriental kids cute? They're all musical, you know, that kind of stuff. I had to fight a lot of stuff. I had to fight to teach them how to read in kindergarten because you know, the curriculum is you have to get down on the floor and play blocks, and you label the blocks, and you teach them. My kids don't need vocabulary for blocks. They all speak. They all do math at home. They all read. They don't all read, but they're ready. And so it was an uphill fight. It's not just for Asian American kids. It's just for early education, because the kids are coming pretty savvy when they, in 1970, by 1970, kids, especially the kids that come from the Chinatown area, are pretty savvy already. They already read, they already draw, they already write, they already speak 2 languages.
So the principal was this battle axe. Helen and I think many other teachers would buy supplies for the kids that ordinarily the school would buy. So one day one of the teachers was able to break into the supply closet that the principal always kept locked. And in the supply closet there were felt marker pens and all kinds of things, all of which were all dried up.
Yeah.
So the principal would buy supplies or have supplies shipped to the school because she was afraid that people would misuse the supplies for the kids. She locked them in a closet until the supplies were no good anymore.
I used to have to steal Xerox paper from the center and other places to mimeograph things for my children to do.
Who in this room knows what a mimeograph is?
Ditto. Ditto is worse. It's the purple stuff, you know.
Unfortunately, there are a few of us.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I bought supplies all the way to the
sure
day
you
I
did.
retired.
I'm sure you did, yeah.
But Helen also would buy breakfast because it's not a startling proposition that really young kids who are hungry have a lot of problem learning than in comparison to kids from the same background, same socioeconomic level who are not hungry.
Not so much here, but in other schools where I taught. That breakfast made a difference in their performance for the day. I'm not talking about a big stack of pancakes. I'm talking about a bowl of Cheerios.
And you still have families where the 2 main meals for the kids
At school,
are
right.
at school.
Mhm.
Yeah. Until they'll last them till lunchtime when they get their free hot lunch, you know.
Well, so it depends on what exactly the period of time is, but there's an aspect that I'm not sure everyone knew was going on at the time. There's certainly lots of people who were working to try and establish Asian American studies, including mostly students, 1 or 2 faculty members. There was a lot of resistance in the administration and among the great bulk of faculty. And all of that's understandable. The problems of public and private universities have always been problems of not enough in the way of resources, greater demands than the resources can meet. It's not quite a zero-sum game, but it's often viewed as a zero-sum game. There's also the question about, is a new field for study a legitimate field? And many fields that we consider to be legitimate today, when they first came into being, were viewed as being illegitimate, improper, immoral fields. Think about the fact that Galileo was thrown into prison, and we can go through the rest of the history, whereas today he would be welcome as a distinguished professor of astronomy and physics or a bunch of other things. So every new field, since civilization has existed, has met some resistance and sometimes very active resistance. So there was a feeling that Asian American or what was then called Black American or other forms of ethnic studies were not legitimate. And it turned out that I had gotten myself into a poker game with faculty in the history department. And really friendly, nice people. We'd meet, it's friendly poker. I would always enjoy taking their money if I could. But as an extension of that, I started being part of a poker game that a fellow by the name of David Saxon was in. David Saxon then was the Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. He was the ¡2 administrator on campus after Charles Young. He's an amazing human being in a lot of ways, but I thought of him as the devil because he didn't, at least when I spoke with him, he didn't like ethnic studies. He was very resistant. He wanted to move the ethnic studies centers outside of Campbell Hall at one point, move us to Royce Hall. We didn't want to move to Royce Hall for a variety of reasons. But I had lots of discussions with him, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. He was always very polite, but he, I think, truly believed that this was just a frolic and detour, and that if he just stood pat for long enough, summer would roll around, students would go home, and the problem would be solved. But over time, he changed his mind. He really did change his mind. I tell you, it's an interesting story. Fast forward some decades. First of all, he became the president of the entire University of California system, and I think one of the best UC presidents ever. He was always a very modest man. After he retired from the UC presidency, came back, he and his wife had a home in Westwood, just east of Hillgard. And then there is a lecture that's the David Saxon lecture in physics. So this is decades after I left UCLA. Someone I know happens to be my brother. One of my brothers calls and says, oh, he was invited to give the David Saxon lecture. He wanted to let me know and the date, and if I wanted to drop by and listen, that'd be great. So I said, sure, that'll be fun. So after the lecture, people have a little reception in the faculty lounge in the physics department, and we're chatting around and sipping lemonade or whatever. And David Saxon walks in. And he looks at me, he says, Morgan? And because we hadn't seen each other for decades. I said, yeah, and I recognized him. So we ended up just two of us chatting. And he says, Morgan, I want to tell you something. You really taught me a lot. And I thought, oh my gosh, this was the devil. I was pounding the table and negotiating against him all this time. And you could have knocked me over with a feather. And I said, oh, what do you mean? He said, well, you stayed at it. He kept talking about ethnic studies. And it wasn't just, we want this and no, you can't have it. There was a lot more to the discussions. And he said, over time, he changed his mind. He thought it was a good idea. And I think behind the scenes, he did a lot, probably more than anyone else, or at least as much as anyone else, to get ethnic studies on this campus. He wouldn't brag about it. There were others who would love to take credit. I think C.Z. Wilson, who's very outspoken, but very junior. He was a very junior vice chancellor at the time. Some who, at the time, I'm fairly certain were actively resisting it in the administration, highly placed people now take credit for it. But I think in his own quiet way, David had the ability to persuade key faculty, deans, ultimately the chancellor, ultimately the UC system, to go along with ethnic studies.
Interesting. So thank you for sharing that. I don't know that we've heard it from anyone else.
That's because they weren't in the poker game.
Right.
See, you can make friends playing poker.
No, I'm very curious. As a scholar myself and as a mother of a debate team daughter, there were arguments for and against.
Mm-hmm.
And can you recall any of the conversations you had, the substantive conversations with David about, the arguments for, and then maybe some of his misgivings at that time?
Well, many of the arguments ended up on both sides of the ledger, so instead of just taking pro and con, I would say that there was always an active discussion about resources. And if the resources could be found, which they weren't going to be found, why should it be a center? Why not a department? Department sounds better to the extent a student understands the way in which universities are organized. But centers, research centers, traditional research centers, have some advantages and disadvantages compared to a department. Why not have an Asian American historian who is just in the history department? Why does there have to be a separate center? And you can see that you could have reasonable minds where both reasonable minds favor Asian American studies, but how should it be organized? Shouldn't it be part of American history? Does it do an injustice to say somehow it's separate? So, and even a slightly better, or at least a different example, should the history of blacks in the Americas be just a separate subject, or should it be an interwoven, important, integral part of the history of the Americas and the United States in particular? Obviously, we fought our bloodiest war in the Civil War, and it goes well beyond that, both before the war and after the war, through Reconstruction and into the early 1900s and on and on. So a lot of the history of the United States, in fact, involved racial, political issues. And isn't that better taught as a single integrated part of American history? I can't say that's an unreasonable point of view, but I would say on the other side, that's not the way the history's been taught. The history in the United States from elementary school through college was always taught from the white man's point of view, period. So why should it suddenly dramatically change where all the scholars growing up being socialized in the American educational system suddenly have a completely different viewpoint to American history? That didn't make sense. So sometimes you need to break out something to shine more light on it. And no doubt in other areas, professions as an example. No doubt there was a time where people were just doctors. Then there became people who were surgeons. And then later surgeons decided, we should give people a little sip of scotch and a piece of leather. And then, maybe we can give them some chemicals to really help dull the pain and other things. And then someone says, maybe we should invent something called anesthesiology and have people who are anesthesiologists who specialize in that area. So the development of new areas is often a reaction to the deficiencies of the existing areas. At least that's the way I viewed ethnic studies. So there's nothing inherently wrong with saying we should have ethnic studies as part of sociology. Yes, but we didn't have it. Or ethnic studies as part of the history of the United States, but we didn't have it.
So do you think he was, so he must have been persuaded pretty quickly in a relatively short period of time to then try to change his mind and convince enough of his colleagues to be more supportive?
Yes, so I think so, and I knew enough about universities and how they operate to throw a positive light on it. People would say that universities involve faculty, people want to be collegial, people want to have buy-in, people rebel against things that are hierarchical, and all that makes sense in the way good universities operate. And so the chancellor or executive vice chancellor don't have the power to lay down by fiat without a lot of very strong blowback. I'm going to create a new department, a new set of centers, or I'm going to do this or that. I think it's very important to get buy-in. And indeed, something like the Asian American Study Centers, without getting buy-in early on with the right people, doesn't have to be a majority, but the right people in a sustaining manner would mean that it would be easy to kill off 3 years down the road, or whenever the next tough budget cycle took place. So I have no doubt that he did a lot of hard, heavy lifting behind the scenes. But he wasn't the kind of guy to complain about it. He wasn't the kind of guy, people who are like car sales people. If you ever bought a car, it could be a new car or a used car, you negotiate with the salesperson, and the salesperson says, okay, give me your best price, and you say, okay, $14,500, and then he comes back, he says, I just talked to the sales manager, and I went to bat for you, and I pulled out all the stops, and I was going to cut my commission, and we can't do $14,500, it has to be $15,750, I'm sorry. He wasn't doing that, but no doubt, in the behind the scenes, he was fighting hard, but persuading people to come along. Yes. So Franklin Murphy was very revered in the UC system, in the greater Los Angeles community. He ended up going to the Los Angeles Times. Charles Young was viewed as, right or wrongly, as the young upstart. Yes, he had a PhD, but people would say, people in the faculty, but is he really a scholar? Where are his academic credentials? I don't think that's fair, but many faculty believe that anyone who's going to be a chancellor should really have the academic chops. And he was very, very young. And then we mentioned some of the turmoil time of the 60s and what was happening and the war protests. So you're new on the job, you're young, some segments of the campus, some segments of the faculty question your chops. Oh, you have some other issues interwoven with this, the Angela Davis issue. She was a young professor who was an avowed communist. That became a huge issue. It actually turns out that the law firm I eventually joined represented the academic senate in suing the regents because the governor said that Angela Davis should be fired. So it's just a small world coincidence that I happened to join a firm that was suing the regents over the firing of a professor because, well, not only was she a communist, but she was a woman, of course, and she was black. So she had 3 strikes against her. I say that only half in jest. because I do think those things worked against her. So I think that Chuck Young wanted to, in every area, move very cautiously, not rock the boat. Suddenly deciding to build ethnic studies centers would be rocking the boat. With everything else going on at the time. So because all of my discussions and negotiations were with David Saxon, my sense is that Chuck Young would have been happy if things just went away. It was just a matter of controversy. No meant students would be unhappy. There might be protests. What would the shape of the protests be? The optics might not look good. You have minority students at a public university protesting against the administration. So if it was a problem that just went away, given where he was, that might be a very good thing. Now, that's a bit of supposition, but I didn't ever have the sense that he was there spearheading it, because I think if he was a big supporter, whether it was David Saxon or other people would have said that. Boy, the chancellor's behind it, and that's really good. So I'll tell you something very interesting about David Saxon, my old nemesis. I didn't know it until many years later. When he was a young physics professor here at UCLA, there was a requirement of a loyalty oath put into place by the regents. So all faculty had to declare their loyalty and to say they weren't communists. I think this was the 1950s. And David Saxon, physics professor, said, I'm not signing it under threat of being fired. So he didn't sign it. I think he was fired. He stood his moral ground. So that tells you a little bit about the David Saxon I got to know.
That's a great story.
Yeah, sometimes you think someone's your enemy, but deep down inside they end up being your best friend.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. Thanks for putting that on the record. I know I'm going to apologize in advance to Helen because I have a bunch of questions that may have to do with after you graduated. But if you do recall, please chime right on in. And these are questions about the early years of the establishment of Asian American Studies, the center. So that was in 69, 68.
16, yeah. I think of 69 as the year.
The official year.
Yes.
I have no
Well,
idea,
you were
but
around
know
at the
what?
time?
They worked around it because, like Philip, he was interested and worked with Asian American Studies, but he was in the history department.
Right. Helen's referring to Philip Wong, who taught Asian history,
Right.
Chinese history, the history of China. But he was very supportive and very
Yeah.
good and
See,
got
so-
things rolling. And I forgot what his title was. It could have been director or interim director. I don't think he wanted to be long-term director of the Asian American Studies. His heart academically was Chinese history. There wasn't really an organized plan. It was free-flowing, or another way to describe it, it was all very chaotic. People would decide, hey, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? So everyone had a lot of bad ideas at one time or another, I include myself. And so a lot of things would get started, and then they would peter out, and then people's attention would turn somewhere else. Eventually, we had some paid positions. So because you've already interviewed her two daughters, you probably know about Elsie. And so she was one of the early people who was a member of the staff.
She was probably the only paid member of the staff.
Initially, I
don't think anybody
think
else got paid.
no, Yuji was on the payroll, but maybe because of JARP, Japanese American Research Project, I think, because he and a fellow by the name of Yasuo were working on creating archival materials for JARP, organizing them, translating them, and things like that. So my recollection is for a lot of the period of time, Yuji was on the payroll, but he was also doing things that were essentially part of what would become the Asian American Studies Center, or after the center was officially formed, or a part of the Asian American
And
Studies
Alan
Center
was
itself.
in a different department. I forgot what department it was, health or something. Alan Nisho. He was here, but he wasn't paid by the Asian American Studies Center.
Let's see.
Actually, we just interviewed him.
Yeah, school of social welfare, maybe?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was at USC, and then he left USC to take the interim directorship. And then I think after 2 years, he got a job offer at Long Beach State and moved to Long Beach.
So
Is this
actually, I'm referring to an earlier period of time. I
Oh.
think it was in the late 60s. In any event, just to say so-and-so had an office sounds awfully fancy, right? But he had an office, I did, a whole bunch of other people sort of took over space. But I thought part of the time he was a student here, but I could be wrong. But his position at USC and Long Beach State was long after.
Way after.
Yeah.
Way after.
Oh, yeah, but at SC, he was at SC as a PhD student, finishing up his
I think that was
PhD.
after too.
He said he was doing his PhD at USC when he got the call to be the interim director. So
All of that was later.
Oh, I see.
What I'm remembering is 68, 69, maybe 70. He was here and had a position
Okay.
here, or a title, or he was involved. His wife, Yvonne, had some involvement.
She
She
was a friend
became a
of mine.
school teacher.
Yeah.
Um,
And
Franklin
Odo
Odo
I was just going to say
showed up.
Franklin was here.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to remind you Franklin Odo was here too.
Yeah. And then Franklin went to a different college or university, and then he went to the Smithsonian.
And what was your role here at the center?
Generating chaos.
I saw in one of the early brochures you were associate director or assistant.
Yeah, we all gave ourselves titles. I was thinking philosopher king, but no one thought that would make sense. So maybe assistant philosopher king.
But you guys were
would
writing
have ruled the
grants and
day.
stuff like that.
Yeah,
to
we
get money.
we
That's what most of these
we
guys
made
did.
proposals, and we did all kinds of things. We did all kinds of things where we didn't know what we were doing. Isn't that fun? Right? Some people say, let's make a film, Eddie. Let's make a journal. It went on and on. So a lot of things were done by, we were all little babies in a sense, and we were learning to walk or crawl or whatever. And because we're students, it was okay, right? People got their income through other ways. I sorted mail. I worked at PBX, telephone switchboard. I worked the front desk of a dormitory. I hashed in a sorority house. You got free meals by serving meals. I sold jewelry boxes. I did all kinds of things to earn income and protest the war, as well as doing this.
And taking 28 units.
Well, and I dabbled a little bit at the beginning in regular student politics, because when I first started school here, some people said, run for the student council.
Right, you were on the student council.
Yeah. Isn't that terrible? I mean, I was doing all these different things simultaneously.
So, yeah, it's kind of that heavy question about when you look back upon your years at UCLA during that time, if there was any anecdote or moment or memory that helps show what impact your life at UCLA was and what impact that had on the rest of your life trajectory.
Go ahead.
I don't know. I haven't thought that deeply in a long time. I don't know.
For myself, I don't think it's any one thing. I learned a lot from a variety of different people, and some indirectly. I learned a lot just observing how other people behaved in situations. I learned what seemed to work, what seemed not to work, persuading people. I do remember when I was very young kid, wet behind the ears, Yuji made some suggestions to me in terms of writing. Not to suggest I'm a good writer, but I can remember that, and that was very nice and helpful. I think that it was a whole confluence of things and people and events at the time in a very unplanned fashion that helped shape my thinking about the world. It's not as if I came in as this blank piece of clay, but it focused everything in a compressed period of time. And I can't think of another period of time where so many what I thought were world earth-shattering events were happening one after the other. Well, I looked at the world as having these huge gulfs between people of different backgrounds, groups, economic status, neighborhoods, you name it. That didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. It seemed self-evident to me that it didn't make a whole lot of sense, that it was all counterproductive. But we as a society let our society grow up that way for many decades before. We're still trying to knock down those barriers. They still exist. It's still startling to me how many people in enormously wealthy areas of the United States are well below the poverty level. It's kind of crazy. So a lot of those problems still persist. I don't know that it motivated me to do one thing or another. I was really just enjoying learning about everything and anything, and then I just happened to decide I would learn a little bit of law. And I remember at an early point in time, everyone was interviewing with law firms, and I wasn't. And some weeks went by, and I finally asked one of my friends, I said, well, why is everyone interviewing with these law firms? And he explained why. And I said, oh. And I let some other weeks go by. And then I finally said, well, since everyone's going to interview, maybe I'll go and just sign up for an interview. And the interviewer from this big major law firm, very prestigious firm, asked whether I wanted to be in which department, litigation, corporate, mergers and acquisition, trusts and estates. And I said, well, to be honest, I don't know that I want to be a lawyer, much less a lawyer at a firm like yours, much less what department in your firm. I really don't know that I want to practice law. And if I do want to practice law, I don't know whether I would like to be a DA or a public defender or something else, much less practice in a big law firm like yours. He was shocked. He was shocked. I don't know why. What's wrong if some youngster doesn't know what they want to do in their career? I actually am shocked when people in law school say, well, I really want to be a tax lawyer.
Yeah, I've always wanted to be a tax lawyer since I was 15. Oh, there's something wrong with this guy.
Yeah, most kids grow up, they want to be a firefighter or something else, maybe a fighter pilot or a veterinarian. I can understand those things, right? Because people can have some association with them. But unless one's mother or father happen to be a tax lawyer, you don't really run into tax lawyers.
But it seems like you always seem to follow what was interesting to you,
Yes.
which is, you know, I think
Yes.
something that probably started early on.
Yes, yes. And it turns out I began to appreciate that law is many things. It can be an instrument of change. It can be an instrument against change. It can be an instrument of change in a negative fashion. But one does get the opportunity to represent people, stand up for them, help them achieve their goals, hopefully get some good results. And that's nice.
It's not just UCLA, but having had all the experience going to school, meeting people, being at the center, you know, you just learn to see the bigger picture of the world. It's not just yourself. And you have a sense that you want to make a contribution in some way. And it could be quietly, or it could be very noisily. But so I've chosen the quiet way. So I do my thing. I never went to the protests. I never got heads cracked. I never rallied somewhere because that just wasn't me. Plus, I was so scared, so conservative. As a matter of fact, when I walked on campus those days when they were protesting, people like you would ask, come and walk with us. You look so conservative. They won't arrest us because you just look so ordinary. I didn't have the long hair. I didn't have the sandals. I didn't have the hippie look. But that's me. So I just do my things my way. I contribute by doing what I do best. What I do best is teach, work with children, work with children's communities, work with schools, change teachers' minds. Well, when you're young and you're energetic, you think you can do everything, and you do. For a long time, you can keep that up. But after a while, you get a little jaded because you realize, in the bigger picture, you hardly make a ripple, but you can only do what you have control over. So you do the best you can within your realm. Your classroom, your school, your district, your parent, your PTA, whatever you can, or the teachers' union. But why I decided to retire fairly early. I didn't retire real early, but I could have worked to 65, but I didn't, because I think the school system wore me out. The way it is structured just wore me out.
So you started as a teacher, and then did you go into any administrative positions?
No, I thought about it, but I wanted to be with the kids. I don't want to shuffle paper. And I could shuffle paper if I wanted to, which I really did, but I wanted to be in the classroom because that's what I enjoyed, and that's what I found rewarding. My first school is my love, Castellar Elementary School. And then where did I go?
We went to Connecticut.
We went to Connecticut, I taught there. Then we went to Boston, I taught in Lian. I came back, I taught in Inglewood for a long time.
So let me tell you a story about Helen. There was a time when teaching jobs were very hard to find, and when we moved to Boston, the Boston City Schools, I think, were going to have 6 openings, and they had 9,000 applications. And Helen applied there, applied to other surrounding school districts. We didn't expect she would get any job with such a surplus of teachers and so few openings. So I was enrolled in law school. Helen says, well, I might as well get a master's degree. So she applied to Boston University, gets admitted. So she starts a full-time master's degree program. Then the Boston City Schools offered her a job. And then another school district, Lynn, Massachusetts, offered her a job. So she decided to take the full-time Lynn, Massachusetts job. And she had 2 full-time jobs, one as a full-time graduate student and one as a full-time teacher. And not only that,
Just do what you have to do.
she still found time to torture me. She'd take dance classes, and including tap dancing, and we had this tiny little apartment that had a wooden floor, so she'd come home after her tap dance lessons at night and want to do tap dancing. So she had 3 full-time jobs: teaching, full-time graduate student, and full-time torturing me.
We had a good time in Boston, though, we did. The years we were there was very fulfilling. It was very fun.
We start out in Los Angeles, then we go to New Haven because of school for this self-created program, and then to the Boston area when I decided to enroll in law school. And then we went to San Francisco because I was clerking for a judge for 1 year, and then after that returned to Los Angeles.
Here's a funny anecdote. When we were in San Francisco, I couldn't find a teaching job. They wanted me to do day-to-day sub. I'm not getting on the bus day-to-day, not knowing what grade, not knowing what, for $100 a day. Are you crazy? So I said, no, I'm going to go find some other job. It was the first time I really had to go and like pound the pavement to look for something. So I went through the ads and stuff, and I finally went to an agency, and there wasn't much they can do because I can't type. So I ended up as a proofreader at a large law firm, and they love school teachers because we are meticulous with the red pencil. So I got hired straight away. So I was down in the proofreading room without windows, without looking at stuff. And then the lawyers were bringing their stuff down, and they found out this gal is really good. She wasted her talents down here. So I went upstairs and became a paralegal for a year.
And the head of their word processing
center.
center.
And then the head of their word processing center got fired for some reason. And that nobody had the organizational skills. So I became the head of the, what did they call it, VIDEC section, their word processing center. I don't type, you know that.
Well, that prepared you for the classroom.
Well, no, it's the other way.
I mean, the other way around.
No, but if you're head of the word processing center, you need to be organized.
Yeah.
And if you're a legal assistant or paralegal, you need to be organized. Right. And I think good teachers, good school teachers, need to be organized.
And you need to know how to disseminate the work, how to, give responsibility to different people. So that was fun. Actually, I think I made more money than you did that year you clerked.
Maybe. I'll pay you back one day.
He was in San Francisco clerking for a federal judge. That's why we spent 1 year in San Francisco. And it was known it was a 1-year deal. That's what clerkships are.
Yeah, no, those are hard to get, especially now.
Yeah, it's hard to get a job that pays you so little.
Yeah, it is.
Can you identify particular people, issues, events, or aha moments that have made you who you are today?
Well, if there was one thing, it's something I had nothing at all to do with. But I truly mean that I was very lucky to be born in the United States. I could easily have been born in China, behind the bamboo curtain, and would have grown up under Mao's control and probably gone through the Cultural Revolution. Who knows what I'd be doing today. So just growing up in the United States was by not chance alone. I told you the story about my mom, my hero, but because she and my dad had the fortitude to come here, that was very, very lucky. And my brothers and I, we went through public schools, and at the time, there were lots of really good public schools throughout the United States. So that's part of the good luck of being born in the United States. And then, of course, by the time I got to UCLA, another public school, I'm still angry that they were overcharging me at $80.50 a quarter, but I can live with it. I think education's always been very important for both of us individually. We always saw it as being important for the world at large, for everyone in our local community and the broad community. I think that can be the great leveler. I think there's nothing more special than learning something from someone else. One can't put a dollar value on it. When Helen first started teaching kindergarten and I'd go and visit her class and she'd teach the kids something, there'd be a child who would go up to Helen and the kindergartner would just hug her leg. Now that's pretty special because Helen taught that child something, and it was invaluable to the child to know that he or she learned something new. So education is very important. Things that are related to education, research, advancing knowledge, sharing it with others, pushing it out to the broad community, not just keeping it in the academy. I think funding of education and research in every area at public and private universities is getting more and more challenging. And since we've been lucky enough to be able to help out a little bit, we're really happy to do that. It's not that we're big steak eaters, but if we were big steak eaters, we can eat as much steak as we want. So we're happy to share what we have to help other people.
On the same vein, I'm happy to support the center, and I'm hoping that when people find out there are Asians who will come out and really support financially these centers, things will be better. But people tend not to look at this stuff. They once they leave campus, they don't see it anymore. We just want to generate some interest to foster this because it's ongoing. It's not a one-time deal.
Well, I think more people recognize the importance of
Nowadays,
it.
yeah.
I think there's been a lot of change over the last several decades. Actually, I didn't mention this to you. A couple of days ago, I was speaking at the Stanford Law School at a conference. And after I spoke, and there were a number of people who wanted to speak with me, ask me questions, and you'd expect all the questions to be about law and the subject that I was speaking about, and they mostly were. But this Asian woman came up to me and said, "Oh, thank you, I really enjoyed your talk." And then she paused and said, "And thank you for all that you've done for Asian American Studies." Completely different audience. I wouldn't have known how or why she would know that, but it was interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah. Public institutions like this don't know how to raise money. You should see how Harvard does it. That's why they're so rich. We got hire, but UCLA does hire professional people who raise money, but they're just not as good at it. And maybe they don't have the base from which to draw the endowments.
Sure. I am guessing that the issues today are the issues that existed 20 years ago and 40 years ago and many years before that, and that they're issues that exist at all major research universities. What every single one of them, or nearly all of them, say is that we do research, teaching, dissemination of information broadly into the community at large, and public service. The last two, it's almost complete lip service from how the institutions behave. Someone who writes a brilliant article or brilliant book or series of articles is going to advance in the academic circles, even if they don't spend 1 minute on public service over all the years that they are on the tenure track before they're considered for tenure. So too with the dissemination of information more broadly. I think most people would say the universities do differ on the degree to which they give weight to teaching. So it's not quite close to zero as on the third and fourth criteria, but universities as a whole give probably a lot less weight to teaching than what students would like the universities to do. There are certainly outstanding teachers at UCLA and many other places who spend a lot of time and energy and effort well beyond the call of duty or what's expected, and they're just fabulous teachers, and that will always be the case. But there isn't a correlation between that effort and the results of their teaching with advancing to tenure, as an example. Those tensions, I think, have always existed, and they exist today.
Anything that you would like to share that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to add?
Well, it's a question, and that has to do with the other three ethnic studies centers and what can be done to increase cooperation and joint programs and learning from one another. I had the sense at the very beginning there was a great spirit of cooperation among the students. That made sense. I think it also made sense because the number of minority students was far fewer. So it would be as if someone said, well, I want to form the Korean American Studies Center. Well, then you'd have such a small group of students, it would be hard to get anything rolling. So what can be done in working with the other ethnic studies center here at UCLA?